Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the UCLA YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I'm Maura Resnick, the Executive Director of the Nazarian Center, and it's my pleasure to present today's conversation with journalist and author Yardena Schwartz on her new book, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 Massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's an engrossing, beautifully written work that deepens our understanding of the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the state of the conflict today. Yardena will be discussing the book with Steve Zipperstein, Associate Director of the UCLA Center for Middle East Development, our co-sponsor for this morning's program. Thank you, Steve and CMED. We look forward to a fascinating conversation. Now let me formally introduce our speakers. Yardena Schwartz is an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer who was based in Israel for a decade until 2023. Her reporting has appeared in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Time, National Geographic, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs, among other publications. Yardena previously worked at NBC News, Nightly News with Brian Williams, and MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports. She graduated with honors from Columbia University in 2011, received an Emmy nomination for her work at MSNBC in 2013, and the Religious News Association Award for Excellence in Magazine Reporting in 2016. Yardena now lives in New York's Hudson Valley with her husband and children. Ghosts of a Holy War is her first book. Steve Zipperstein is Associate Director of the UCLA Center for Middle East Development and Adjunct Assistant Professor at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Zipperstein is a former U.S. federal prosecutor and the former Chief Legal Officer of Verizon Wireless and BlackBerry Limited. He's the author of 3 books on the legal history of Israel-Palestine, The Legal Case for Palestine, A Critical Assessment, Zionism, Palestinian Nationalism and the Law, 1939 to 1948, and Law and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, The Trials of Palestine. After Yardena and Steve's conversation, there'll be time for audience Q&A, so please type your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Steve and Yardena, over to you.
Thank you, Maura. Welcome, Yardena. We're so thrilled to have you. And we're so thrilled to have our audience members from here in the United States and from around the world, including from the following countries: Israel, Afghanistan, Argentina, Canada, Andorra, Austria, Germany, Egypt, Netherlands, Luxembourg, South Africa, Spain, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Great Britain. What an amazing audience we have to discuss this incredible book that Yardena has written. What a gift to all of us who are interested in the history, the amazing history and tragic history of the region. Yardena, I'm going to ask you to begin, if you don't mind, by just describing how you got into the research. Your book begins with the amazing, heartbreaking story of a young Jewish man from Memphis, Tennessee, David Scheinberg. I'll stop there and let you pick up the story of David and his departure from the United States of America to Hebron in September of 1928. Tell us what happened and how you got into this.
So first of all, I just want to thank you so much for bringing me here. And I want to say that in the past 4 months since my book was published, I've done many events across the United States and Canada, but I have never had an audience with people from such a diverse background. So this is really such a treat. So thank you all for joining. And to answer your question about David Scheinberg and his extraordinary story, this young man was 22 years old when he sailed from New York Harbor to British Mandate Palestine in 1928 to study Torah at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the Holy Land in what was then British Mandate Palestine. And he went at a time when young men did not leave their family in the United States to study Torah in the land of Israel. Today, that's quite common among, religious families, but then it was unheard of. His family was shocked. They thought he was insane. His parents didn't support his move. yet he did it anyway, and he got help from a very prominent rabbi, an early religious Zionist, actually, despite the fact that David was not a Zionist. He, at the time, was an anti-Zionist, very different from the anti-Zionists of today. And today, from our own perspective, we would consider him a Zionist. You know, he was this young American Jewish man who moved to the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. But at the time, there was a lot of antagonism against the Zionist movement by traditional Jews like David, who saw Zionism as this secular contamination of religion. They believed that the return of the Jewish masses to Zion could only be achieved through God's will and the arrival of the Messiah. So he went really just to become closer to his Jewish roots and to study Torah, and he arrived in September 1928 in Hebron, the second holiest city in Judaism, the burial place of Abraham and the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. And he lived there for 1 year, and for that entire year, every single week, he wrote to his family in Memphis, Tennessee, these beautiful, vivid letters depicting what life was like in Hebron, not just for him and the other yeshiva students, but for the very small, tight-knit Jewish community. It was about 800 Jews living amidst about 20,000 Muslims in Hebron, and they lived side by side in peace. And that was one of the most fascinating things for me in reading his letters, was to realize that, you know, a little less than 100 years ago, Hebron was this beacon of coexistence in Palestine, a place where Jews and Arabs didn't just live side by side in peace, but they had businesses together. They drank coffee in each other's homes. They attended each other's weddings and celebrate holidays. And that was just really fascinating for me, because before I read David's letters, I had been to Hebron only once. And the brief time I had spent in Hebron, a beacon of coexistence would be the furthest thing I would use to describe Hebron today. It's an epicenter of this conflict. It's, you know, the antithesis of what David was describing in his letters. But yeah, his letters were kind of the jumping off point for me writing this book. And we can talk more about how you know, I got those letters, because it's
Yeah, tell us, how did you come into possession? David Steinberg, I said Steinberg earlier, excuse me for mispronouncing his name. You cover his letters so beautifully in the early portions of the book. How did the letters fall into your hands? How did you come into possession of them?
So it was really a writer's dream. I had always dreamed of writing a book, but I always felt like, you know, I didn't know what I would write about, and I was always hoping that something would just fall into my lap. And that's exactly what happened. I woke up on New Year's Day 2019 to an email from a writer whose work is probably the work I most admire, by an English language writer writing about Israel, living in Israel. His name is Yossi Klein Halevi. I'd imagine many people on this webinar know that name. He's an incredible writer, an author, journalist. He actually was contacted by this family in Memphis after they had discovered this box of letters in their attic. Just happenstance. They were just moving to a new home, found this box in their attic that they didn't know was there. And it took them 10 years to kind of go through all these letters, organizing them, digitizing them. Finally, they archived them in their synagogue in Memphis and realized, you know, this is a treasure trove of history. We can't just keep this here. We want this story to be told. And because Yossi, you know, is this famous author, an incredible writer, they thought of him. I had never written a book. I had, you know, been working as a journalist in Israel, writing feature stories for many magazines and newspapers, but I had never written a book. So they wouldn't have known about me. I was, you know, an unknown at the time. And Yossi, when he was introduced to this family, he recognized that this was an incredible story, but he couldn't take it on because he was already working on his next books. But he promised this family he would find someone to tell this story, and I'm very honored, incredibly honored that he asked me that very day. He asked me if I would want to write this book, and I said yes, but how do you write a book? And he, for the next 5 years while I was working on this book, he was my mentor, guiding me through the process, giving me invaluable advice along the way. And I am so grateful not only to him for introducing me to this family, but to this family for entrusting me with these letters and in telling David's story, and especially for their trust in me, because my only requirement was that I would have complete creative freedom and editorial freedom. I didn't want to have to run the book by anyone for their approval, or I didn't want the family to dictate how I write the book, because that would feel like a major conflict of interest as a journalist if they were giving me these letters but saying, oh, but we get to decide how you tell this story. So I'm so grateful to them for trusting me and for giving me that freedom.
Yeah, it was really a wonderful vote of confidence on your part by the family. And you, as I said, do a beautiful job of describing, telling his story through his letters during the 11 months that he lived in Hebron. And so tell us what happened in August of 1929, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So in August of 1929, on August 24th, 1929, what happened in Hebron was 3,000 Muslim men armed with swords, daggers, and axes marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron and went from house to house, breaking into homes that had been locked the night before. And Jews, young and old, were huddled in their homes in fear because these riots had shaken them to their core. As I said before, this had been, this very sleepy, peaceful place, this holy city where Jews and Arabs have lived side by side. And so the Jews living in Hebron were taken by surprise when these riots erupted, despite the fact that they had been warned, actually, 2 days before these riots erupted. Members of the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the IDF, had visited Hebron, warning them that riots were going to break out. But the Jewish leaders of Hebron insisted that they would be safe, that their Arab neighbors would not hurt them, and that they didn't want the Haganah there because they felt that their presence would be a provocation. So they rejected the Haganah's offers of protection and told them to leave. And sure enough, the warnings were true. And on August 24th, 1929, this absolute massacre decimated the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron. 67 Jewish men, women, and children, all of them unarmed, were butchered by their neighbors. And the atrocities
including David Shainberg.
Including David Shainberg, that's right. So he was among about 20 other yeshiva students who were slaughtered. But it wasn't just yeshiva students who were killed. There were, one of the most prominent Jewish residents of Hebron was a man named Eliezer Slonim. His father was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron. Eliezer himself had the best relations with the Arabs of Hebron, to the point where his home was presumed to be the safest place in Hebron that day. So 70 people had taken refuge in his home, absolutely sure that, whatever happened elsewhere in Hebron would not happen in his home, because he was such close friends with so many of the Arab leaders of Hebron. He was the head of the Hebron branch of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. And so he had, overseen loans to many businessmen in Hebron. And in fact, the morning of the massacre, several of his friends gathered outside his home and promised him that they wouldn't leave the steps of his house. They would stay there all day to make sure that the mobs didn't enter his home. But by the end of the day, he had been killed along with his wife, who was also raped. And their 5-year-old son was also killed alongside them, and his wife's parents were both killed. Their 11-month-old son only managed to survive because one of the other survivors in their home recognized that he was still breathing after the rioters left. They killed more than 24 people in his home alone, including rabbis, children, women. And, his wife wasn't the only one who was raped that day. There were teenage girls who were raped in front of their families. It was really just horrific atrocities that were carried out that day, including in the home that David Shainberg was renting with other yeshiva students from a local rabbi. He too was killed.
So
And yeah.
go ahead. I want to come to what you believe were the causes of this, but before we do that, I think it's very important for our audience, if you wouldn't mind pointing out, and you write so eloquently about this, that there were some acts of tremendous heroism by some of the local Arabs in Hebron. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so more than 4 times the number of Jews who were killed were saved by their Muslim neighbors. So at least there are different lists that were put together that day, but based on all of the lists, at least 200 people, potentially as many as 400 people, were rescued by their Muslim neighbors who risked their own lives to save their Jewish neighbors and friends, whether it was by hiding them in their homes or in their cellars, or standing outside their doors and telling the mobs, you won't come into this house over my dead body. And there was actually one really just iconic story that I came across of a elderly man. He was in his 70s, and his home, one of his homes was being rented by the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron, Rabbi Yaakov Slonim, who was Eliezer Slonim's father. And so the stories of these two Slonim men kind of symbolize the two spectrums of humanity we saw that day. The side of humanity that is capable of, the most horrific atrocities, and the side of humanity that is capable of, the most courageous acts of kindness. So this elderly man, his name was Abu Shakir Amr. He was actually in his vineyards that day when his young son ran to the vineyards and told him that this massacre was taking place. And he literally arrived on a white horse to rescue this Jewish family that was renting his home. He stood outside the door and told this mob, he said, I won't let you in this house. If you want to enter, you're going to have to do so over my dead body. And he ended up being stabbed, but he didn't back down. And he ended up saving about 30 people that were hiding in that home, including the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful to you for telling that story, because far too often we neglect to recognize the heroism of some of the Arab neighbors who stepped forward against all odds with great courage to do just that. Also, before we get to the underlying causes, one other note: Britain, of course, was the ostensible ruler of Palestine at the time under a mandate from the League of Nations that took effect in 1922 after World War I. Where were the British police? You write about one police officer, Kafarada in particular, but where were the British police during this horrific massacre?
So there were about 40 policemen in Hebron, all under the auspices of this British chief of police, Raymond Kafarada. And yet only one of those police officers was Jewish. All of the others were Arab. And sadly, many of these Arab policemen either took part in the atrocities and actually participated in the massacre itself, or they just stood kind of guard outside of these Jewish homes and allowed these atrocities to take place while they did nothing. Some of them did try to stop the rioters, but they were just overpowered. And for some inexplicable reason that was never discovered over the course of the British Commission and hearings that followed the massacre, the British police chief, Kafarada, had actually taken away or told his policemen not to use their guns that day. And only at the end of the day, when not the end of the day, at the end of this 2-hour massacre that had taken place all that morning, when the rioters finally set their sights on Kafarada, and the head of one of these mobs told the men behind him, kill the British police chief, then he finally fired his gun and told the rest of his policemen to go get their guns. And that's what finally dispersed the rioters. So if he had fired his gun earlier that day when the rioters were targeting Jews and not him, who knows how many people could have been saved. And that was just the case in Hebron, but throughout Palestine, these riots reached every part of Palestine. I mean, in Hebron, that was kind of the climax of it, and that was the site of the majority of the bloodshed. I mean, the atrocities committed in Hebron were worse than anywhere else, and 133 Jews were killed that week, but 67 of them were killed in Hebron. And in other places as well, the British were just caught off guard for no reason, because they had seen all of the signs that this was going to happen, and yet they had no military force in Palestine at the time, only a police force, and the vast majority of those police officers were Arabs, and they didn't only take part in the massacre in Hebron, but they participated in the riots throughout Palestine. Not all
Right.
of them, of course, but
Yeah.
there were many other cases of Arab policemen joining these riots. And the British, in the immediate hours after this massacre took place, they brought in warships and planes and troops from throughout the British Empire. But those steps arguably should have been taken prior to the massacre breaking out, because it was very clear. I mean, Raymond Kafarada himself had been warned that this riot was going to happen, not just by the Haganah, but also by Arab mayors and Arab notables from villages outside of Hebron had called him to and asked for him to meet with them, because they told him that they had gotten word from their own townspeople, and they had received a letter from the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amina Husseini, calling for violence against Jews.
So just a quick note for our audience, by the way, I've seen a few questions typed into the Q&A box. Please, audience, send us more questions. I'm going to just go for another 5 or 10 minutes with Yardena, and then we will turn it over to the audience. I will be asking questions. Maura Resnick, who you met at the beginning, will pop in with some of your questions. The more of your questions we get, the better. We would really love to have as many questions as possible. So, Yardena, I think for our conversation here with you and I, if you could talk about, and you alluded to it already, but a little bit more of what led to this shocking outbreak of violence. There was no Israel at the time. There was no Israeli occupation of the West Bank at the time. There was no Hamas at the time. Why all of a sudden, after years of friendly coexistence in Hebron, did this happen? And obviously, as we think about this, what comes to mind, of course, is October 7, 2023. And in your book, you draw a direct line between August of 1929 and October of 2023. Along the way, by the way, telling the history of Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in an extremely erudite way. But these beginning and end points, August 29 of 1929, October of 2023, you draw a direct line between the two, and the parallels are striking. But the differences are striking too. No Israel, no occupation, no Hamas in 1929. Why did this happen then?
Right, and there were no Israeli soldiers, no
Right.
state of Israel. This was 2 decades before the state of Israel was born. At the time, it was, as you said, the British Mandate of Palestine. And there were many things at play here, one of which is a man I mentioned earlier, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amina Husseini. He was an extremely corrupt, unpopular leader. And what he did was he realized that he could distract his people from these allegations of corruption and nepotism and misuse of funds, and his absolute failure to bring about any kind of rights for his own people that the British were trying to give them. Basically, after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, had awakened this kind of backlash against Zionism and against Jewish immigration and land purchases and increased rights for Jewish residents of Palestine who had been kind of second-class citizens under Ottoman rule before the British took over Palestine. Instead of working with the British, which, they had been trying to see how they could work out these tensions between the Jewish minority in Palestine and the Arab majority, what he did was just boycott those efforts and carry out a lot of strikes and attacks. And what he realized was that he could unite his people against Zionism by weaponizing Islam and Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is kind of the pattern he began in 1928. Right around the time that David Schoenberg arrived in Palestine, he began to spread a rumor that the Jewish population in Palestine was plotting to conquer and destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem to rebuild their ancient temple. And over the course of a year, he didn't work to just kind of perpetuate that lie. But what he also did was carry out a campaign to limit Jewish access to the Western Wall, which was the only area where Jews could pray close to the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount was completely off limits to Jews in 1929, or to any non-Muslims. And the only place they could pray was this very narrow corridor along the Western Wall, nothing like what we know today. It was at the time this very tiny, cramped alleyway. There was a Muslim neighborhood alongside of it. And what the Mufti did was he worked to increase tensions at the Western Wall by limiting Jewish access to it, by carrying out building projects. He had a door built into the Western Wall that would allow Muslims to go up to Al-Aqsa and increase the chances of there being friction between Jewish worshippers, the Western Wall, and these Muslim passersby who would increasingly attack Jewish worshippers at the wall. He also began a campaign to convince the British that the Western Wall was actually an Islamic holy site, which ran counter to the reality on the ground, which was that Muslim residents would pass by smoking cigarettes near the Western Wall, walking by with their donkeys. Their donkeys would relieve themselves at the Western Wall. This was clearly not an Islamic holy site. Otherwise, those things wouldn't be done there. And yet it worked. The British didn't know the history, and so they kind of just didn't counter this disinformation campaign that the Mufti was spreading about this Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa, despite the fact that they had actually appointed him to his post as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And so this disinformation campaign lasted for a year, and the Muslims of Palestine began to be convinced that the Jews really were plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa when they were protesting against the British failure to protect Jewish worshippers, the Western Wall, and calling for the wall to be given to the Jews. That kind of played into the Mufti's hands because it showed these people that he was working to convince all year, look, I was right. The Jews really are trying to conquer Al-Aqsa. The Western Wall is just their first step in this plan. And so the reason the campaign worked so successfully and came to its climax on August 24th, 1929, was because earlier in that August, so about 10 days before the massacre, was Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, when every year thousands of Jews would gather at the Western Wall to pray. The 9th of Av is the most sorrowful day on the Jewish calendar, and it's the day in Jewish history when both Jewish temples were destroyed and other, very tragic events in Jewish history took place on that day. And that also worked into the hands of the Mufti, because he was able to point to that massive demonstration at the Western Wall, thousands of Jews there, to his people and saying, look, it's happening. And when there was a smaller march the next day by revisionist Zionist youth to the wall, chanting, "The wall is ours," and protesting against the British failure to protect Jewish worshippers at the wall, that was kind of just the spark that set it all off. And after that day, there was just a cascade of violent attacks by Arabs on Jews in Jerusalem, retaliatory attacks by Jews against Arabs. And on August 23rd, 1929, on a Friday, the day before the massacre in Hebron, imams at Al-Aqsa called on the faithful to defend Islam with their blood. And that was where the riots began. When worshippers flowed from the mosque and down to the old city, they began to attack Jewish passersby, set fire to Jewish businesses, and the riots just engulfed Palestine. And in a matter of days, 133 Jews had been killed across the country, and more than 400 more had been wounded. But more casualties and more brutality were seen in Hebron than anywhere else.
And of course, again, the common motif of Al-Aqsa, 1929, Al-Aqsa flood, October 2023. It's really striking, the parallels between the two events as you so eloquently describe in the book. I keep saying eloquent, but that's exactly what your book is. And let me ask you though, Yardena, you mentioned this a bit. How do how does the Palestinian Authority, what is their official historiography regarding regarding August 1929? How do they explain what happened to their school children?
So it's interesting because they have kind of continued the claims of the Grand Mufti, not just his claims that preceded the massacre, but also his and other Arab leaders' claims which immediately followed the massacre, which was a complete denial of the atrocities and a simultaneous blaming of their Jewish victims for what they had endured, whether it was by claiming that it was yeshiva students in Hebron who had actually killed Jews in Hebron in order to raise funds from the diaspora for their yeshiva, or the British blaming Jewish immigration and land purchases for sparking, fear among the Arab population of Palestine. And so, this through line we see from 1929 through today is haunting and devastating because, as we all know, October 7th was immediately followed by this simultaneous denial of the atrocities, not only by Arab leaders, but by, Westerners. And this victim blaming that, it didn't happen in a vacuum, there was context, all of this kind of justification for horrific atrocities that were carried out on October 7th against innocent men, women, and children. We saw that also in 1929. And today, every year, the Palestinian Authority honors the perpetrators of the massacre. So in the immediate aftermath of the riots in 1929, as I mentioned earlier, there was this British commission that was carried out to investigate the causes of the riots. And at the end of this commission and these trials that the British conducted, just 3 people really were taken to task for what they had done, while thousands had been arrested and put on trial. Many of their sentences were commuted or reduced to, the point of non-existence. But 3 men were hung by the British at Akko prison. And to this day, those 3 men are honored as 3 of the earliest heroes of the Palestinian cause. The day of their execution became, 1 year later, was announced as annual Martyrs' Day for Arabs of Palestine. And to this day, that is still Martyrs' Day under the Palestinian Authority. And the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, has always been hailed as a hero of the Palestinian people as well, despite the fact that less than 2 decades, just 10 years after inciting this massacre in Palestine, he went on to ally himself and his cause with Adolf Hitler and was living in a Nazi-financed estate in Berlin throughout World War II, serving as the Nazis' chief Arab voice, spreading Nazi propaganda throughout the Arab world, recruiting tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazi cause. He was even placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals after World War II, and yet he was never prosecuted for those crimes.
Yeah. By the way, as you've been talking, you've been doing an amazing job of answering a lot of the questions that have come in from our audience, and so I won't repeat those that you've already answered, but I do want to come to our fantastic questions from the audience. The first one I'm going to come to is from John Stern, who says that the early 20th century life that you described, Yardena, in Hebron, seems to be one in which Muslims and Jews recognize their religious and cultural similarities, seeing themselves as cousins. Can you point to any events or movements that has led to today's world in which the two peoples no longer see themselves in each other in that way? Wonderful
That's an
question.
excellent question. Yeah, I love that question. And actually, when you read the book, you'll see that I spent a lot of time with Israelis and Palestinians in Hebron today. And I was so struck and amazed by how similar they were. So when I would spend time with this one woman, Tzipi Schlissel, who lives across the street from actually a Palestinian descendant of one of those courageous Arab families who saved their Jewish neighbors in 1929. Today, these people are enemies. You know, she would never talk to him. Apparently, one of her sons often harasses one of this Arab man's sons. His name is Taisir Abu Aisha. His son has been beaten up by young Israelis in Hebron. And yet, when I was speaking to both of them, they struck me as so similar. You know, they both love Hebron so much for the very same reasons. You know, it's the burial place of Abraham. They both go to the tomb of the patriarchs. For Tzipi, it's Marat HaMachpelah. For Taisir, it's the Ibrahimi Mosque, but it's the same place. And they worship there for the very same reason. And they recognize, you know, the importance of Abraham and the model he set, and yet it struck me that, you know, they are unable to recognize that they are his descendants, and that they live such a life that is so spiritual. They both, you know, love the land they live on. Taisir has chickens in his garden and these ancient olive trees that he loves so much. And Tzipi grows wheat in her backyard and, you know, just loves the views of Hebron. And yet they're unable to speak today because they both hold so much trauma. Taisir holds trauma from another massacre, the 1994 Hebron massacre by Baruch Goldstein. And of course, ongoing trauma from the result of, you know, the restrictions that that influence his everyday life and those of his children. And he spoke to me about how um, one of his children, actually his son's twin, didn't survive childbirth because his wife, it took so long for them to get to the hospital because of the checkpoints they had to go through. And on another occasion, another child of theirs was lost on the way because they ended up walking instead of waiting for an ambulance because of these checkpoints. And again, his wife lost that child. And, you know, Tzipi, it has been attacked by Palestinians in Hebron. Once a man was about to stab her and potentially kill her, when that potential stabber was killed by a Jewish passersby who saw him in the act of being about to stab Tzipi, and he shot him. But you know, it's just devastating how spiritual their life is, and that common spirituality, and yet they also have this common thread of being traumatized by violence, and you know, kind of how the conflict has affected their everyday lives.
And yet Hebron today is still the only city in the West Bank where Jews and Palestinians are both living, correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's the only actually the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank. It's home to about 250,000 Palestinians and about 800 Jews who live on the Israeli-controlled side of Hebron. Israel controls 20% of Hebron, while the Palestinian Authority controls 80%. And, you know, as I write in the book, you know, you that might sound like this, you know, beautiful hope for coexistence, that Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in this city in the West Bank. But if you've ever been to Hebron today, it is the furthest thing from peaceful coexistence. And, I think it doesn't have to be that way. If you think about how similar these people are and how spiritual they are, I think it's really kind of the weaponization of Islam and this disinformation campaign that continues today that keeps them from living in peace. Because that disinformation campaign centered around Al-Aqsa, not only does that still continue today, but there's also a disinformation campaign surrounding a supposed Jewish plot to take over Ibrahimi Mosque, which is, the Arabic name for the Tomb of the Patriarchs. The Tomb of the Patriarchs is divided into two sides, a Muslim side and a Jewish side, and Israel enforces that rule, at 10 days a year on Muslim holidays, the entire site is open only to Muslims, and 10 days a year, the site is only open to Jews. And yet, if you look at Palestinian media, you'll see that on those days when it's closed, when it's only open for Jews, they'll mischaracterize that and say Jews storm Ibrahimi Mosque, Israel closes Ibrahimi Mosque to Muslims. And yet that's just something that happens 10 days a year for both people. You don't see Israel and Israeli media framing it that way on these Muslim holidays when it's close to Jews, because it's a fact, it's close to Jews because it's a Muslim holiday. And so you see kind of this role, this destructive role that disinformation and propaganda plays in fueling this conflict. And just like in 1929, it serves the interests of corrupt leaders who have no interest in peace. They want to further this conflict. And I heard this from many of the Palestinians I interviewed for this book, that, they understand that their leaders do not want peace because their leaders will cease to receive billions of dollars in funding that the international community sends them, and that money doesn't go to help ordinary Palestinians. It goes to line the pockets of corrupt leaders, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or Hamas.
Maura, you have a question from the audience.
I do, and it's about the extremist Jews. These are religious Jews. They're rabbis. They're yeshiva students. And it struck me, how can they justify the violence that they perpetrate against their Arab neighbors, as religious Jews? Maybe the same question could be asked of their Arab neighbors who consider themselves religious Muslims. But this was one thing that is particularly troubling when reading your book. So I wondered if you could comment about that, and about the conflict as a religious conflict rather than a political conflict.
Absolutely. So I think, first of all, it's really important to point out that this is a holy war and this conflict is fueled by religion, and yet it is not a war between Islam and Judaism. It is a war between those who seek to weaponize religion against those who seek peace, and to see, this shared Abrahamic origins of our faiths as a source of hope and cooperation rather than a source of friction. And so on both sides, you have these extremists, and in Hebron, I think, is a place where you see it most. You see these young, zealous, radicalized young Jewish men who are very religious, and they see the conflict almost in a very similar way that Islamic extremists see it, is that, we cannot exist together. It's us or them. And they see it as, this land was promised to us by God. It's only for Jews. But again, it's important to point out that these are a minority. These are fringe. These do not represent, just in the same way that not all Palestinians are terrorists, not all Jewish settlers in the West Bank are violent extremists. In fact, probably about 5% are. But their role is so destructive that it has kind of painted the entire settlement movement as violent and radical. And I think that, the same is very true for Palestinian extremists or Islamic extremists in general. They have kind of, painted Islam, for some people who don't know as much about Islam, as, this religion of violence, when of course that's not the case.
So we have a great question from Marina Ingman. Going back to 1929, her question is, did any other religious minorities suffer similar attacks at around the same time? Christians, Druzim,
Right.
others?
So
No.
in 1929, when the riots were being perpetrated, whether it was in Hebron or Jerusalem, they were actually, and it's unclear whether the Christian residents of these homes did this themselves or whether the Muslim rioters did this to kind of tell other rioters not to hit that house. But there were crosses written onto these homes, and those homes were passed over. In Hebron, there were no there was a very small number of Christians. It was almost only Muslims and Jews living in Hebron in 1929, but in Jerusalem there was a significant Christian population, and those homes had crosses placed on them, and they were, Christians weren't attacked in 1929. It was just Jews who were attacked.
Yeah. And we do have contemporaneous evidence of the marking of homes with crucifixes from the #2 person in the British government, Harry Luke, in Jerusalem at the time. He recorded that in his diary that you and I are both aware of. So another question from Janet Halbert. She says, both sides have their extremists, but there are peace builders too. And Janet wants to know, Yardena, whether for your book you interviewed any of the peace builders.
I did, Janet. Thank you so much for asking. I should say that, we discussed this in the beginning, that I started working on this book in 2019. As you can imagine, October 7th drastically changed my book. I was actually halfway through my manuscript on October 7th, and I ended up needing to, reimagine the trajectory of the book. And so as a result, there were chapters I had planned to write that I didn't end up writing because I had to make room for new chapters about October 7th and its aftermath and what led to October 7th. So one of those chapters was actually going to focus on a young man I met during my time in Hebron, who I see as kind of the epitome of what Palestinian leadership could be and what it should be and what I hope it will be. I think it will take many years for the Palestinian people to recover from this past year, but I do hope that one of the upsides to this last year will be a realization that the corrupt, violent leaders of the last 100 years cannot continue to lead the Palestinian people. What they have brought is only more death and destruction and, no hopes for peace. And this young man from Hebron, his name is Mahmoud Jabari. He no longer lives in Hebron because the kind of person he is not really welcome in Palestinian society today. He is someone who favors peace, a two-state solution, cooperation between Jews and Arabs, between Palestinians and Israelis. He wants to see, a Palestinian state, but not the kind that many in the pro-Palestine, and I say pro-Palestine because I don't think many of the people in the pro-Palestine movement in the West are actually working in the interests of the Palestinian people. I think they're working against the interests of the Palestinian people by supporting actors like Hamas and Hezbollah instead of people like Mahmoud. And there are many others like Mahmoud. He's not the only one. There are many Palestinians who want a better future alongside Israel. People like Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, who was raised in Gaza, now lives in America. Mahmoud is from Hebron. He's actually a descendant of one of the mayors of Hebron. The Jabari clan is very prominent in Hebron, and Mahmoud spent time in Israeli prison, but he participated in Seeds of Peace, which is one reason why, these kinds of movements, these kinds of organizations like Seeds of Peace are sometimes dismissed by people as, kumbaya, unrealistic, too idealistic, but they make a difference. And for someone like Mahmoud, they made a world of difference. And he now works at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. And he is an amazing person. And I wish I could have kept that chapter in my book, but obviously I wish October 7th hadn't happened for many other reasons, not just so I could have profiled Mahmoud in my book.
Well, maybe that could be the beginning of your next book.
Yardena, as a follow-up, perhaps you could talk about Jewish settlers who are working towards peace in the same way that follow on to that similar question. And also there was an important question about the role of the IDF in Hebron. And, you know, a lot of times from your reporting, it seemed like from your book, it seemed that the IDF was very hands-off in terms of the violence perpetrated by settlers against Palestinians. So perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that and how that actually feeds into the conflict as opposed to being helpful.
Yeah. Okay. So, Janet, I think I failed to answer the full spectrum of your question because you did ask about peacemakers on both sides, and I focused on Palestinians. I think because, sadly, I think most of us would be aware of peacemakers on the Israeli side. I mean, after all, Israel has tried to achieve peace for many years. Israel, offered Palestinian state in 2000, 2008. Those offers were rejected, and there are many, peace movements in Israel. There's Peace Now, there's Standing Together, so many examples of Israeli peacemakers. But in terms of the settlers,
Right.
there are actually there's a movement called Roots Shorashim, in not in Hebron, but just kind of like the West Bank in general. And it's a really remarkable movement of settlers and Palestinians working together to achieve peace because they understand that in any peace deal, it's the West Bank. That's what we're talking about. So it can't really be solved by Jews in Tel Aviv who don't even live alongside Palestinians. It needs to happen, from the people who are living on the ground side by side. So that's one example. In Hebron, there are kind of like business relations and conversations between settlers and Palestinians in Hebron. But it's more about the settlers do not support a two-state solution. It's more about kind of encouraging Israel to annex the West Bank, and there are Palestinian supporters of annexation. There are many Palestinians, they won't speak out publicly and say that, but they, would prefer to live under Israel than under corrupt Palestinian Authority, or certainly under Hamas, for obvious reasons. But they can't really speak out and say that. So those efforts are more just kind of like on an individual level, unlike Roots, where it really is a conversation about working together, perhaps in like a confederacy sort of solution, not necessarily a two-state solution. And the role the IDF plays in Hebron, it's really interesting because in many of my interviews, it came out that in some cases of settler violence, Palestinians said that IDF soldiers actually came to their aid, but they're not able to help so much because under their kind of mandate from the Israeli government, they're there for a very specific reason. Their reason for being there is to protect Jewish settlers. And so when you see, when they observe, a clash between settlers and Palestinians, they're supposed to protect the settlers. They're not supposed to stop a settler from beating up a Palestinian, so they don't. And, they could get in trouble for actually, grabbing a settler and taking them off of a Palestinian. And yet, in some cases in my interviews, that is what soldiers did. But more often than not, you do see soldiers kind of just standing by, unable to do anything, almost in the way that, it kind of reminded me of the role that the British police played in 1929, where they kind of just like stood by and did nothing. And,
Yeah.
Ever since October 7th, we've seen more examples as a result of the anger and, resentment that many Israelis felt after October 7th. There were more stories of settlers carrying out violent attacks while soldiers kind of just stood by and allowed it to happen and didn't intervene.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, but I'm actually going to read a couple of questions right now, and then Yardena, if you can take maybe 3 minutes or so, because we need to make some announcements as we conclude the webinar. And again, I want to thank the audience for your superb questions. I mean, they They reflect different points of view, which is exactly what we strive for in the university environment. And I'm going to read a question that does come from a different point of view from, and I don't know it because I've only got the first initial of this person, if it's Mr. or Ms. Caraza, who's asked a couple of questions, and I'll read the first one from Mr. Caraza, who wants to know whether or not um, the 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 Jewish-Israeli narrative regarding what the Jews would describe or the Israelis would describe as the fleeing of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 and 1949, as opposed to the Palestinian narrative, which is that they were ejected, they were ousted, the Nakba. Is the Jewish narrative, does it stem from the trauma of the Hebron massacre? Very interesting question, psychologically and politically, and I want to thank the questioner for that. And then another question, and you can answer these however you want, and then I'll stop, is if you could comment on the irony. You mentioned the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. You said he was appointed by the British to his role. And the questioner says, yes, and wasn't the British person that appointed him a Jew? Sir Herbert Samuel, the High Commissioner. And could you comment on the irony of the fact that it was a Jew who appointed the notorious Haj Amin al-Husseini to his position? And with that, I will end my portion of this webinar. I'll stay on, but Yardena, thank you so much. And for our audience, here's the book. There you go. Please, if you're interested, go to Amazon, buy the book. It is really remarkable. Yardena, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Great questions. So I go into great detail of this in my book, this irony of the first British High Commissioner of Palestine. He was not only Jewish, Herbert Samuel, he was also a Zionist. And it's seen, in hindsight, his appointment of the Grand Mufti was seen as, the greatest blunder in his career. At the time, it made sense to him, despite the fact that the Grand Mufti had already incited another riot in 1920. It was much smaller, far fewer casualties, but nonetheless, it was a violent riot in Jerusalem in 1920. And the Grand Mufti had fled arrest by the British for inciting that riot. And he was pardoned by Herbert Samuel, this Zionist High Commissioner of Palestine, who thought that, it was best to keep your enemies closer. He could win the support of the Arab population of Palestine by appointing this very anti-Zionist young man who was the descendant of one of the most prominent, not the descendant, he was the scion of one of the most prominent Arab families in Palestine at the time, the Husseini family. His own father had been Grand Mufti. His older half-brother had just passed away, leaving the spot of Mufti of Jerusalem open. And that would have made him, and did make him, the most powerful Muslim official in Palestine. But not only that, he was then elected to become the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which the High Commissioner also created as this centralized body to oversee all of the Muslim holy sites and Sharia courts. And that was how he became so corrupt, because he misused some of those funds to do things like build a hotel and to build mansions for himself in East Jerusalem. So, this kind of, he sort of set the formula for every Palestinian leader, this corruption, the corruption that he was accused of. Arafat was super corrupt, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and yet they have all used kind of these lies and propaganda and disinformation to distract their people from their inability to lead them out of perpetual poverty. And the other question regarding, sorry, remind me.
The narrative around
Yes.
Palestinian refugees.
Yes. Okay. So that's an amazing question. I don't think that narrative was informed by the trauma of 1929. But I think that, so much of this conflict revolves around these, dueling narratives, whether it's about the trauma of 1948 versus the victory of 1948. if you look at the factual accounts of what happened in 1948, it was a mix of both. It was both flight, Palestinians fleeing the war, also fleeing as a result of rumors of atrocities committed by Zionist militias, or as a result of actual, really horrific, there were massacres perpetrated in 1948 by both sides. It was a vicious war. And the accounts that emerged from the scholarship of people like Benny Morris are really informative accounts, which kind of detail both the accounts of flight and the expulsion by Zionist militias. But this was, again, a war where Jews were also expelled from their own villages and towns. The Jordanians captured territory, the Egyptians captured territory. What I think is interesting is that so much of the history around what happened in 1948, first of all, it didn't just happen in 1948. It began in 1947 as a civil war between the Jews and Arabs living in Palestine. And it began with the declaration of war, of jihad, by the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders, in direct response to the UN vote in 1947 to partition British Mandate into an independent Arab state, an independent Jewish state. And I think what's often, left out of debate around 1948 is that, it didn't have to be a Nakba. It didn't have to be a catastrophe. We didn't have to see 750,000 Arabs become refugees. What we could have seen was an independent Palestine for the first time in history, because at the end of the day, the British Mandate was just the latest in a line of foreign powers that had ruled Palestine. Palestine had never been independent and never has been independent, and could have been independent for the first time in its history in 1947 if the Grand Mufti and every other Arab leader hadn't rejected two states for two people instead of declaring war.
I think that's probably a good point to end. We're at an hour and 1 minute. Perfect timing. And Maura, I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much, Yardena. You're wonderful. Your book is amazing. Thank you for being so willing to take my questions, and especially the wonderful questions from our audience today. And thank you most of all to our terrific audience for attending and for your great questions. Maura,
Well,
over to you.
yes, thank you, Yardena and Steve, for this really wonderful conversation, and also to all our audience for joining us. And also thank you again to the UCLA Center for Middle East Development for co-sponsoring this program. We really appreciate it, and is part of the reason we have so many viewers from around the world. I encourage everyone to purchase your book, Yardena, and it's got so much great information and history in it, and again, beautifully written. So this concludes our programs for winter quarter for the Nazarian Center, but I encourage everyone to check our website and join our mailing list to make sure that you receive information about all of our future programs. So again, thank you all, and goodbye for now. Bye.
Thank you so much.